In the early 1960s, Brazil was experiencing a period of political and social turmoil. After years of democratic governance, calls for social and economic reforms were increasing. In 1964, the country was under the leadership of President João Goulart, who adopted progressive policies aimed at making wealth distribution more equitable. However, fears of communism loomed large, especially after the Cuban Revolution of 1959. On March 31, 1964, the Brazilian military exploited these fears and initiated a coup, overthrowing Goulart. This event marked the beginning of a military regime that would last until 1985. Following the coup, General Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco assumed power. A state of emergency was declared, the constitution was suspended, and the military government began suppressing opposition. Many political activists and journalists were arrested, and widespread torture practices were reported. During this period, a repressive system was established to eradicate any form of dissent. The Brazilian government utilized the media for propaganda, making it difficult for the Brazilian populace to grasp the truth about the events unfolding in the country. Despite the repression, resistance movements emerged. Revolutionary groups like the Revolutionary Army of the People's Freedom and the National Liberation Movement were formed. These groups carried out armed operations against the government, targeting military centers and government symbols. In 1968, the country witnessed severe oppression of dissent. Restrictions were placed on freedom of expression, resulting in the arrest of many students and intellectuals. Yet, amid all this, the resistance continued to grow. Many activists managed to flee abroad, where they found support from other nations. Over time, international pressure began to mount on the Brazilian government. In the 1970s, several countries imposed sanctions on Brazil due to human rights violations. The country also faced an economic crisis that led to deteriorating living conditions for many citizens. In 1974, General Ernesto Geisel assumed power and began adopting a policy of distanciamento, relaxation, where some political prisoners were released and certain freedoms were allowed. However, these changes were superficial, as repression continued in the background. By the early 1980s, democratic movements in Brazil began to gain greater momentum. In 1984, massive protests erupted in the streets demanding a return to democracy. These protests became known as the Diretas Já, direct elections now, with millions of citizens participating. On January 15, 1985, Tancredo Neves was elected president. Despite his death before taking office, his election symbolized the end of military rule, with his vice president, José Sarney, assuming the presidency. As the military regime came to an end, Brazil began the process of rebuilding its democratic institutions. Committees were formed to investigate human rights violations, providing support for victims and their families.